I'm going to spend the next 15 minutes or so talking about weed management, so another different set of pests that we fight every year. I'd like to start that off by recognizing there's several different ways we can define success too. So like me personally, as an agronomist and a crop consultant, the first thing that comes to mind when I think successful weed management is I'm thinking about a clean field. You know, I got all the weeds killed, did a really good job there. But you know, working with a lot of y'all over the winter, this time of year especially, you're budgeting things out, you know, you're buying chemical. Right now, a lot of you are thinking more like a successful weed management program is one that's profitable. Something that you can do an adequate job controlling weeds, saves yourself some money, you know, but do it in a way that you're not losing yield either. And certainly I recognize it's not usually profitable to kill every single weed in that field too. You got to find that balance. But there's a third definition of success I think we all need to start paying a little bit more attention to, and I think all of us are, but with all this resistance that we've got developing, you know, glyphosate, Roundup resistance in a lot of the water hemp specifically, I want you to think a little bit about sustainability of a long-term weed management program. You know, are the herbicide program you have together now, is that something you can keep doing for a long time and be productive, be profitable, be successful, keep yourself in business a long time, and or hand down these fields to somebody else without a huge mess on their hands. So to elaborate on that, I mean, I think we can agree this is definitely unsuccessful weed management. You know, this is more like a field of water hemp with a few soybeans out in it. You know, this would be an example of, you know, potentially this guy was extremely profitable, you know, for 15 years just doing glyphosate one pass post, but it caught up with him. You know, it's not sustainable. We got resistance developed here. We got a huge mess on our hands. This is going to be very unprofitable for several years. It's going to be very hard to get through this. So that's kind of the importance of thinking about all three of these things together too. You know, certainly not easy, but I think I've got some things here to help you get through that. So I'm going to talk about three main things in this talk, three main keys, and I'm going to elaborate on all these points as we go through the rest of this. But targeted weed size, either pre-emerge or early post, using multiple effective tank mixes together, and using an overlapping residuals concept that I'll explain some more. But I think these three can help us be successful in all definitions. So the first one is targeted weed size, and in this one I'm going to use an example from the University of Minnesota. On the far left is a picture of corn sprayed at V2 at just 1 to 2 inch weeds. At the bottom there that says 207 bushels per acre. That was the same as using a really strong pre-emerge and an early post. So that's kind of our baseline. Now that middle picture is when things get delayed, in this case delayed about 10 days. The corn's up to V4, the weeds have gone to 3 to 4 inches. And you see with no pre-emergence, you've got just a carpet of weeds there. Now you can still get them all killed. And a lot of times you won't notice a difference in your corn. It's not going to look sick or stunted or anything like that. But when you take it to yield, it was actually 5 bushels less. So using easy math, $3 corn, hopefully it's better than that. But that 5 bushels then would be $15 to the acre that you lost if you got delayed there. You know, that's tolerable. We could argue a lot of different ways. You could save that by skipping the pre, things like that. But the danger here is that far right picture. And that far right picture is only 5 days later than that middle picture. You're just going 5 more days later, but it's warm in June. You got plenty of soil moisture. That corn's up to V6 into that critical weed-free period where it's starting to develop some of its yield. And those weeds jump up too. They jump up to 6-inch weeds. And there you're knocking off an additional 40 bushel to the acre. Again, at $3, that's $135 that you lost. That's a big deal. In corn especially, just because you can get them all killed early, it's very risky, and so that's where I really lean on these pre-emergence herbicides to help give you a baseline, buys you time in the spring in case it gets wet, in case you get behind on planting. That's very important to preserve your yield, okay? Now soybeans are a little bit more forgiving. It's not quite as dramatic as you go to that far right, but the same trend does occur. The thing that's more important with soybeans is that weed control aspect. Like if you've got that middle picture, you've got a carpet of water hemp there, and you're in soybeans, your options are a little bit more limited. And in some cases, it can be hard to get all those killed with glyphosate and or some PPOs and some of those things. You've got big weeds covering small weeds. It's just hard to get enough coverage for one. And the other one is you have extreme selection pressure for that post application without a pre. So you got maybe 1,000 weeds in a square meter that you're trying to kill, whereas with a pre, you could thin that down and you only got to kill 100. And so your chances of resistance, your sustainability goes way up if you're using a pre-emergence herbicide together. And targeting those weeds with the pre, you're targeting them when they're seeds, really, really small. And then post, I want you to come in and target them early again when they're small. A lot easier to kill when they're 1 inch tall. That second key would give you the answer to this question, but looking at your farm, looking at your fields, you know, if you don't have a bad resistance problem, that's great. But let's say you really don't want to develop resistance, and I'd say most of us would be in that boat. So if you're trying to prevent resistance from coming onto your farm, is it better to rotate your modes of action, which would be like using Liberty 1 year, glyphosate the next year, Liberty, glyphosate, or is it better to tank mix multiple things together, throwing in PPOs and other things with your glyphosate? And the answer is tank mixing multiple effective modes of action together is much, much more effective. And I'm going to explain that with this data set from Illinois. And this is coming from kind of the epicenter where that glyphosate resistance really started. They sampled a bunch of fields for resistance in 2010. So up here is the probability of resistance in 2010. So 1 up there at the top is 100% likely that you've got resistance, 0 at the bottom. And then they had an applicator, a big commercial applicator that took really, really good records on what he sprayed and when and all that. And so they dug into that data set, and that's on the bottom here, is what was the average number of mode of actions used per application per year, okay? So that 1.5, that'd be a 1.5 average mode of actions for the year. That'd be like using DuPonts in Light followed by glyphosate. Now Light is Valor and Harmony and Classic. Harmony and Classic are both ALSs, so that only counts as 1 mode of action, and then you got the PPO. So you got 2 modes of action in your pre, just 1 mode of action in your post, you average out to that 1.5. Let's say as an example, the other one there on the right, that 2.5, you're still using your 2 modes of action in your pre, and you got glyphosate, then you add in prefix. Now prefix is fumazepin and metolachlor. That's like your Flex Star and others, and then metolachlor is Dual or Cinch and other names with that. But that's 3 modes of action then in your post, 2 in your pre, you average out to that 2.5, okay? And then looking at this chart, if you move from that 1.5 over to the right to that 2.5, that means you are 83 times less likely to develop resistance 5 or 6 years later. So multiple effective modes of action tank mixed together in one application is much more effective for preventing resistance. The rotating, in fact, was almost a little bit worse at developing resistance. And the problem with that is usually the guys that did the rotate thing are using straight Liberty followed by straight glyphosate. Straight Liberty, straight glyphosate. They're not tank mixing things together. So you do delay it just a little bit by rotating, but you're still definitely developing resistance if you're not tank mixing multiple things together. Now the other thing I want to point out here down on the bottom, that's still not 0. So even as you get to that 2.5, 2 3/4, when you're using a lot of mode of actions, it's still not 0. And that's where the cultural control methods really come into play. And cultural control is basically anything that's non-chemical. So that's like narrow row soybeans, okay, keeping your populations up, tillage, row cultivation, crop rotation is another one, you know, not doing beans on beans or corn on corn on corn forever. Cereal rye cover crops can help with some of that thing. All of those really complement a chemical control program, and putting them all together is how we can really reduce our resistance there. Now the third key I want to talk about is overlapping residuals, and I've got a picture here to describe that. This is not overlapping residuals, just so you know, but that blue would be like a pre-emergent herbicide, and so up at the top is like 100% weed control, really good weed control, but eventually that residual starts to wear off, okay? And it's not in a straight line, but I'm just using this as an example. But eventually it wears off. We usually get a flush of weeds, things start to get pretty woolly, and then we come in there with a post, glyphosate, PPOs, some of those, and get all the weeds killed. And then eventually our soybean canopy starts to take over, okay, and that's the yellow. And so eventually their soybeans get really big, they shade it all out, and that pretty well controls the weeds. But the trouble is you got 2 things. You're letting it get pretty woolly, and then there's a time after your post for your canopy too. There's another time for more weeds to come in there. And then in a lot of cases, we're having a little bit of trouble getting them all killed with that one-shot post. And so in an overlapping residual, that's when you would move that post application up before that pre wears completely off, and you'd put in another residual along with that. And so that's that Cinch or Dual metolachlor I was talking about. Prefix has got that in that, of course. Zidua is another one. Outlook and Warrant, those are other ones you can use, and you overlap those. And so before your pre-residual wears off, you're putting another residual on, and then eventually your soybean canopy takes over. Now there's a couple ways to make this better. Again, I'm talking cultural control. So if you're in narrow row beans, that soybean canopy can start to take over a little bit sooner. You can also move that pre back. You can scoot that blue triangle further right, and that'll buy you a lot more time too. Now the trouble is with a lot of us, we're still doing like 2,4-D in a burn down, especially you no-till guys. You got to wait a week for that. And so that kind of limits you. You can separate those out. You can do a burn down and then a separate pre with residual before the soybeans emerge. That's a great program. Costs you a little bit extra money though. Going forward with dicamba beans, you could switch that 2,4-D to dicamba and you don't have to wait a week. And so you can spray that dicamba even after you plant and put that with your pre, and you can move that blue triangle further right and buy yourself some more time that way too. And so to dive into that a little bit more, I'm talking about the Roundup Ready 2 Extend system here. And that's got the dual mode of action for glyphosate and dicamba resistance. Low volatility, dicambas then can be sprayed in season. So you can't use Banville or Clarity, it's these new ones that'll allow you to spray in season. Excellent crop safety with that. Again, no plant back, you don't have to wait to plant if you're using dicamba ahead of these. And Pioneer, we just advanced a class of beans with great yield and great agronomics. So they still got the sudden death resistance and some of those key things as well. And so just an example to show you how well this works. This is a terrible, terrible research field out in Marion. Very high population of Roundup resistant water hemp in here. And so you see how nasty it gets when you don't spray anything. On the right then is DuPont's in light as a pre, followed by Roundup, glyphosate in a post. And you see that in light really thins the herd really well. And then that Roundup's helping, still getting a few of them. They're not complete, not every single one is still resistant. And you're cleaning up all the grass and everything else. But you can see by the end of the year, that's going to grow up and get really nasty. And so in most cases, our next backup plan is that picture on the right. That's when you add in Cobra and Cinch there, or on the left. That's a Cobra PPO, a burner. And you see with that, you can clean up a lot more of those, but there's still a lot of green in between the rows. And those are going to grow back, and again, it's going to get pretty woolly. Now that Cinch, again, is dual or metolachlor. That is another residual, but in this case, they did not overlap it. So it's going to help prevent any more weeds from coming up, but it was too late to really overlap with the Enlight. We see on the right, if you switch out that Cobra for the dicamba, that's where you can really get all those cleaned up, and then you've got the Cinch there to help hold it for you. And again, just one more plug for cultural control. It would go a lot better if you had another row down the middle there, get you to canopy a lot quicker. Now with this new dicamba, a lot of you are probably worried in a couple different ways. You know, there's some of you, I'm sure, that are worried you're not going to go this route, you're worried about getting drifted on. And then some of you guys want to go this way, but you're worried about getting it sprayed. And I'm just going to tell you there's a lot of things on this label that I think are going to protect us both ways. I think this label has some new things that will help prevent drift if followed correctly. I think your neighbors can spray dicamba and you can't, and you should be okay. And for you guys that want to use it, that want to spray it, the requirements on here are not unrealistic. You can definitely handle this, and you can still get these fields sprayed without trouble, all right? So just briefly, there's a buffer when there's downwind. On the wind speed, of course not when it's too high, but to help with volatility, you got to have a little bit of a breeze too. You're going to be really careful with our nozzles to have some really big drops, and we're going to be very specific on the tank mix partners you can have in there too to help prevent volatility and things like that. In summary, to wrap it up, the three keys to keep your clean, profitable, and sustainable in the long term. I want to go after targeted weed size, think about that, using multiple effective modes of action in one tank mix, and using that overlapping residuals program, especially when you're having trouble getting things killed post. And putting all that together with those cultural control methods is where we can get a really good, successful weed management program for the long term.